As early as August 1962, Director of Central Intelligence John McCone began to receive unusual intelligence reports. These reports described Russian ships transporting Soviet soldiers and technicians to Cuba, which was governed by dictator Fidel Castro. The Cuban coast was only 90 miles from Florida. On August 22nd, it was reported that as many as 20 Soviet vessels may have arrived in Cuba with military cargo. The world was catapulted into the most dangerous chapter in its history.
They sent a U-2 over Cuba. They took photographs and were able to measure precisely the length of these tubes, and they discovered that they were, in fact, nuclear missiles.
The United States government now had definitive proof from hundreds of photographs taken by U.S. spy planes that the Soviets were installing missile launching sites in Cuba. On October 15th, the CIA observed launchers, missiles, and transport trucks amid active construction at the launching sites. Kennedy had a choice to make: attack the Soviet missile sites, launch an invasion, or install a blockade around the island.
The Joint Chiefs of Staff are unified in their determination that we should bomb and we should invade, and they keep pressing that position.
Kennedy's administration did not know that Soviet missiles were already prepared to fire.
Now, can you imagine our 90,000 troops hitting the beaches, parachuting in, and being blown off the beaches by tactical nuclear weapons? How could the United States not respond? I think we were very lucky that it was Kennedy, because there's no question in my mind that whether it was Johnson or Nixon or Eisenhower, they would have invaded Cuba.
A blockade could be considered a declaration of war, but Kennedy saw it as the best path forward. On October 22nd, 1962, President Kennedy addressed the waiting nation about the Soviet arms buildup in Cuba.
Each of these missiles, in short, is capable of striking Washington, D.C., the Panama Canal, Cape Canaveral, Mexico City, or any other city in the southeastern part of the United States.
With Kennedy's go-ahead, United States naval vessels made their way to form a wall-like blockade around the island of Cuba. With the massive blockade now in effect, Khrushchev made it clear if Soviet ships were sunk or the Americans attempted an invasion, it would be war.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
On October 27th, at the height of the crisis, American U-2 pilot Major Rudolph Anderson was shot down and killed over Cuba while on a surveillance mission. Anderson's death signaled a turning point, a turn for the worse. That same day, a group of U.S. Navy destroyers were positioned above the Soviet submarine B-59. To force the submarine to the surface for identification, the Navy began dropping small explosives called signaling depth charges. The captain of the Soviet submarine, Valentin Savitsky, mistook the depth charges for bombs. What the Navy did not know at the time was that the B-59 had nuclear weapons on board. Thinking that the war had started, Savitsky gave the order to launch one of the nuclear torpedoes. While Kennedy was deciding how to respond to Major Rudolph Anderson's death, Russian submarine B-59 prepared to fire a nuclear torpedo. believing the war had started above them. However, in order to fire the weapons, the decision had to be unanimous between all officers. All on board were in favor of the nuclear attack, except for the second-in-command officer named Vasily Arkhipov, who convinced the B-59 crew to halt the launch of the nuclear missile. The submarine rose to the surface and would soon head back to the Soviet Union without incident, thanks to Arkhipov. Behind closed doors, negotiations were conducted between the White House and the Kremlin. Khrushchev presented his final terms for withdrawal to the Kennedy administration. He declared that in order for the Soviets to remove their weapons, the United States must pledge to never invade Cuba again. Khrushchev also demanded the American Jupiter missiles aimed at the Soviet Union be removed from Turkey.
And you can hear on tape John Kennedy saying to them, how can I explain to the American people that I didn't take this offer? If they ever learn that it was on the table, that I could have avoided what happens next, how could I ever explain to them or history that I couldn't take this deal? That's where Kennedy is the leader.